Hello and welcome. Bienvenue tout le monde. And van harte welcome to anyone who may be listening today from the Netherlands. I'm Stephanie Dickey, and I am a professor of art history and Bader Chair in Northern Baroque Art at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I am also the guest curator for the exhibition Rembrandt in Amsterdam, Creativity and Competition, which will be opening soon at the National Gallery of Canada. I am your host and moderator for today's virtual symposium organized in connection with the exhibition. Today, we'll hear from 4 scholars whose research sheds new light on the lively artistic community of 17th century Amsterdam, the city that became Rembrandt's adopted home. Closed captioning is also available in English by clicking the CC button. Now, before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to express my gratitude and acknowledge that the National Gallery of Canada is located on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. While we're currently meeting in a virtual world, suspended in time and space, I'm grateful to all Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land. Today's program will last about 2 hours. Our 4 speakers will share 15-minute presentations with a health break midway through. There will be some time for questions after all the speakers have completed their presentations. In order of presentation, our speakers today are Dr. Jacquelyn N. Coutré, Eleanor Wood Prince Associate Curator in Painting and Sculpture of Europe at the Art Institute of Chicago, Dr. Celeste Brusati, Professor Emerita in Art History from the University of Michigan, Dr. Suzanne van de Meerendonk, Bader Curator at the Agnes Etherington Art Center at Queen's University, and Weixuan Li, PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jacquelyn Coutré. Jacquelyn received her PhD from the New York University with a dissertation on the Dutch artist Jan Lievens. She's held several fellowships and curatorial positions, most recently that of Bader Curator and Researcher of European Art at the Agnes Etherington Art Center, where she organized the traveling exhibition Leiden circa 1630, Rembrandt Emerges, in honor of the 2019 Rembrandt year. In her talk today, Jacquelyn will introduce us to a later moment in the story of Rembrandt and Lievens, who were friends and rivals in Leiden, but then reacquainted when they were both working in Amsterdam later in the 17th century. Jacquelyn, the floor is yours.
I would like to commend Stephanie on what I'm sure will be an outstanding exhibition, and would like to thank her for the invitation to speak. And I would like to extend my appreciation to Jen, Andrea, and Sylvain at the NGC for their flawless organization of this event and their infinite patience with me trying to do something like sharing my screen. In the southeast corner of the first floor of the Royal Palace of Amsterdam, formerly the city's town hall, hangs one of Jan Lievens' most ambitious paintings. It is the second of 6 scenes that illustrate the revolt of the Batavians, the legendary ancestors of the Dutch, against the Romans in the 1st century CE. Lievens' painting shows a gripping moment. A nobleman of the Canafate tribe, Brinio, a man of brute courage, has just been elected leader. As written in the histories by Tacitus, quote, "In accordance with their tribal custom, he was set upon a shield, lifted upon their shoulders, and chosen their chief," unquote. Brinio, sword brandished and dressed in gleaming golden garb, towers over the dozens of halberds, pikes, military banners, and swords. Lievens' painting is adjacent to an earlier scene in this cycle, one depicting the community of Batavians pledging their support to the uprising by the artists Hovert Vlink and Jurjan Ovens. Tacitus records that the one-eyed Civilis gathered the chiefs of the nation and the boldest spirits of the lower class in a sacred grove by night, ostensibly to dine, but truly to assess the oppressions that they had endured under the Romans. He fired their spirits with excited words and a bit of drink, then bound them to rebel against the punishing Romans according to, quote, their national oaths and barbarous rites. The nocturnal woodland setting couches these conspiring figures in secrecy. Though these paintings have remained in situ for the last 400 years, it was another painting of conspiracy that originally hung opposite Liebens's canvas. Now a fragment of its original glory, the painting has been drastically cut down since it hung in the town hall. Executed by Rembrandt van Rijn, it shows the same scene of Claudius Civilis, but presents a clash of swords, noted by Tacitus as a means of consent in his history, Germania, rather than the shaking of hands. The motivation behind the removal of Rembrandt's painting in the summer of 1662 has long perplexed art historians, and speculations vary from the impropriety of presenting Claudius as a one-eyed hero to the distastefully, quote, barbaric, unquote, depiction of the Batavians' clothing and rituals, to the rough manner of the painting's execution. Many of these theories consider the painting in relation to the critique traditionally lobbed against the artist, including foremost his insistent manner of presenting histories in the most natural of ways, without consideration for beauty or decorum. Yet this approach isolates the painting from its role in the series and negates its presence in a politically charged environment. I would like to propose that we consider the paintings depicting Claudius Civilis and Brynio not as discrete representations, but as two halves of a visual whole, which, in turn, contributes to a larger ideological commentary in the town hall. The two artists, of course, did not confront each other for the first time in the 1660s. The eloquent descriptor of a, quote, pair of young and noble from Leiden, unquote, was penned in 1629, that is more than 30 years earlier, by the connoisseur and secretary to the Stateholder, Constantin Huygens. This correlation of the two artists was a natural choice, for their early lives were greatly entwined. They were born but a year apart in Leiden, Rembrandt in 1606, Liebens in 1607, and each received his initial training in that city. The youths completed a second apprenticeship with the preeminent history painter in Amsterdam, Peter Lassmann, within a few years of each other. By 1625, Rembrandt and Liebens had returned to their native city to refine their skills as practicing artists. The intersection between the artists' lives reaches well beyond biography. They shared models, explored the same subjects, worked together to pioneer the tronie or character study as a product for the market, and even ventured into the medium of etching, all of which surfaces their shared ambition as aspiring artists in Leiden. Around 1631, the two men departed the city, Rembrandt for Amsterdam, where he would stay for the rest of his career, Liebens for London, and then Antwerp. During these 13 years apart, both artists established themselves as portraitists and painters of history subjects of great renown. Interestingly, both artists also began to paint landscapes around 1638, likely inspired by prints after the much admired Peter Paul Rubens. When Liebens settled in Amsterdam in 1644, both men possessed international reputations. It is thus not surprising that the two accomplished artists were asked to contribute to the town hall project. The stately building, formally commenced upon the conclusion of the war with Spain in 1648 and lauded as the eighth wonder of the world, served as an enduring monument to peace, such that the primary facade is even crowned by a sculpted personification of Pax. The Dutch Republic's hard-won independence is commemorated in no uncertain terms through the Batavian cycle, featured in the corridors surrounding the hall's grand public space. Not only did the ancient tribe of the Batavians reside in the same region as the citizens of the Dutch Republic, but their uprising against the Romans due to burdensome taxes and plundering raids unmistakably paralleled the situation of the Dutch under Spanish rule. The evolution of the series remains somewhat unclear, though surviving sources fill in some of the details. In November 1659, after he had sketched out 4 large canvases that summer, Flink was contracted by the Amsterdam burgomasters to execute, among others, a series of 8 paintings depicting the Batavian cycle. Flink's death over 2 months later, however, prompted the redistribution of the commission among a number of artists. Documents attest that Lievens was awarded his commission in January 1661, and his receipt of a handsome 1,200 guilders 2 months later indicates the delivery, if not the installation, of his Brunio. The date of the assignment of the Claudius Civilis scene to Rembrandt is unknown. An extant drawing found on the verso of a funeral card bearing the date October 25th, 1661, provides a terminus antiquem for his engagement on the project. His completed canvas was installed in July 1662, according to one witness, or by July 1662, according to one witness. But a contract from late August indicates that revisions had been requested and presumably that the painting had been removed. The imminent visit of the Archduke of Cologne to the town hall in September demanded a swift resolution. The sketch that Flink had designed in the summer of 1659 was resurrected and retouched by Urian Ovens. These facts suggest that the two paintings by the Leiden pair hung in dialogue with each other for no more than 10 months in 1661-62. Elmer Kolfen, following the lead of Gregor Weber and Albert Blankert, argued persuasively in 2011 that the presentation of the Batavian revolt in this space had strong political motivations related to the political climate of Amsterdam in the 1660s. I would like to push the political reading inflected in these paintings further and relate these images to the fundamental tenets of the presiding ideology in Amsterdam during this period. The untimely death of the Prince of Orange in 1650 precipitated a decisive shift in the governance of the Dutch Republic that would be known as the First Stadtholderless period. When Willem II died in November, just 8 days short of the birth of his sole heir, a large assembly convened in The Hague to respond to this leadership crisis. After debating the immense power wielded by the Stadtholder in relation to the 7 provincial states, and the States General, the majority of the provinces refrained from nominating the infant Willem III or a regent to the position of Stadtholder, thereby initiating what would become a 22-year vacancy of the office. This decision sent a powerful message to the Orange family. The elevation of the Prince of Orange to the Stadtholder's position was far from guaranteed in spite of historical precedent. It also endowed the provincial states and the powerful states of Holland and West Friesland, of which Amsterdam was the most influential city, with significant executive might. The ascendant figure that emerged from this debate was Johan de Witt, a young lawyer elected head of the states of Holland and West Friesland in 1653. Through multiple open and secret maneuvers, de Witt elaborated an anti-Stadtholder ideology consisting of the fundamental sovereignty of the provincial states, the appointment of a Stadtholder according to merit only, and the subordination of the Stadtholder's authority to that of the provincial states and the States General. The structure conformed to that of an aristocratic republic, that is, rule by an aristocracy without an eminent head, de Witt's term to denote the multiple roles performed by the distinctively monarch-like Stadtholder. Intrinsic to this belief system, known as the true freedom, was the notion that the strongest republics in history had no permanent Stadtholder. Rather, one was appointed only for specific campaigns. Furthermore, de Witt and his true freedom allies were ardently against unifying the roles of Stadtholder and Captain General in a single person, as had been previously embodied in the Prince of Orange. They believed that such a combination of executive and military power would inevitably lead to tyranny, and the attempted coup on Amsterdam by its Stadtholder Willem II, months before his death in 1650, proved their fears correct. De Witt succeeded in legislating the separation of these two offices until 1672. I propose that these images of Claudius Civilis and Brunio exemplify the doctrine of the true freedom more explicitly than previously acknowledged. Claudius Civilis and Brunio should be read as the separate offices of the Stadtholder and Captain General, specifically, as described in ancient and contemporary texts. Melchior Falkens, in his 1662 city description, characterized Brunio as a beloved leader, called upon to be war chief specifically, whereas Claudius Civilis is the organizer who builds the necessary consensus to initiate the revolt. This coincides with Tacitus's lengthy account of Brennio as the general who led the military assault upon the nearby Roman camps, and Claudius Civilis as, quote, the real leader in this revolt, unquote, the orchestrator of duplicitous movements against his alleged ally, Vespasian. These two leaders represent the two branches of power, executive and military, that de Witt and the Amsterdam burgomaster sought to divorce from each other. It is, of course, impossible to know what Rembrandt's final composition looked like, but Ernst van de Wetering's reconstruction using the painted fragment and the drawing on the funeral card inspires new theories. It is evident that Rembrandt's composition does not complement that by Lieven's. As Erik Jan Slaughter has observed, the scale of the figures would have been too small, and as Albert Blongert has argued, there would have been much visual dissonance between Rembrandt's single-tier arrangement and Lievens's two-tiered composition. While I agree with these assessments, I would like to introduce the idea that Rembrandt's composition failed to communicate one of the principal tenets of the new freedom so endorsed by Amsterdam's burghers, the access to these leadership roles through appointment. In keeping with Tacitus's description, both Rembrandt and Lievens depict ancient practices to convey the narrative. The clash of swords to signal confirmation of the plan to rebel, and the elevation upon a shield to indicate the appointment of a commander. Yet a more contemporary gesture would have been needed to signal the elevation of these two men to leadership positions for this revolt, the two-fingered pledge. The historian Louis van Eidsma wrote in 1653 that the States General requested that oaths of allegiance to new generals be taken by all soldiers with, quote, erected fingers and wanton solemnity, unquote. And new burgomasters were inducted into government with this gesture. This act of digital levitation, if you will, is conspicuously absent from the visual tradition established by Antonio Tempesta and Otto van Veen in the 17th century, a period long before the burgomasters of Amsterdam advocated for the nomination of the Stateholder and Captain General based on merit. Returning to van der Wetering's mock-up, a figure making a similar gesture can be detected at the far left, but in the overall scene, he is negligible. Cast in the shadow far from the captivating glow of the table, this figure unsuccessfully broadcasts the act of oath-taking to, and thus the appointment of, as leader, Claudius Civilis. Might Rembrandt's painting have been removed in conjunction with its dissonant scale and incongruous composition so that he could reposition the crucial figure to a more prominent location, thereby emphasizing in direct correlation to Lievens's painting the election of men to both offices related to the eminent head. By framing these paintings within the context of the town hall's celebration of peace, it becomes clear that it is the paintings by Flinken-Ovens and Lievens that articulate the burgomaster's vision for an enduring peace, the separation of executive and military power, with those offices filled only on a temporary basis. On the crowded market for art in Amsterdam, competition fueled creativity, but creativity was outweighed by the calibration of the visual message to the ambitions of one's patrons. In the largest city hall in the nation Dutch Republic, Amsterdam's burgomasters sought to assert both their authority and their ideals through the decorative program. Rembrandt's painting, compelling though it is, was unsuccessful in communicating the nuances of the political message so fundamental to the identity of the city's most prominent citizens, whereas Lievens's conveyed it with clarity and conviction, thereby securing its enduring presence and bountiful admiration in the Amsterdam Town Hall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacquelyn, for that wonderful reminder of the rich political and cultural context in which Rembrandt and his contemporaries were working. Our next speaker, and welcome to those who may have joined us a bit late. We're glad to have you here. Our next speaker is Dr. Celeste Brusati, who's recently retired from the University of Michigan after a long and distinguished career as a professor of art history. Her publications, of which there are many, on European art and art literature of the 16th and 17th centuries, include Art and Illusion, The Art and Writing of Samuel van Hoogstraten, a book on Johannes Vermeer, and with co-editors Walter Melian and Carl Enenkel, The Authority of the Word, Reflecting on Image and Text in Northern Europe, 1400 to 1800. Most recently, she edited and wrote the introduction to the first English translation of the important art treatise by Rembrandt's former pupil, Samuel van Hoogstraten, Introduction to the Academy of Painting or the Visible World, translated by Jaap Jacobs and just published this year by the Getty Research Institute. Her presentation today explores some of Hoogstraten's ideas about one of the key themes in our exhibition, creative competition. Celeste, the floor is yours.
There we are. Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, and I want to congratulate you on this terrific exhibition, even though I've only seen it in catalog form, and also to thank very much the staff at the gallery. I'm very happy to be retired, but I would certainly enjoy very much working with all of you as I have over the past week or so. So let me begin by introducing you to the curious martial character being decked out by a bevy of lovely maidens and serving as the logo for my presentation today. This is the aspiring painter depicted by Samuel van Hoogstraten on the title page of his magnum opus, The Introduction to the Academy of Painting or the Visible World. It's a nearly 400-page introduction to painting and all that pertains to it. Van Hoogstraten, who trained with Rembrandt in the mid-1640s, was really exceptional among 17th century Dutch painters in writing at length about his art. And this book was a very ambitious effort to describe, as he says, the art of painting and everything pertaining to it, which is a lot, and he goes off on many tangents, and to outline a sequential program of instruction for teaching this art. So it's about art and the teaching of art, but also everything under the sun manages to make its way in some form or other into this text. If this seems a bit daunting, there we go, I'm trying to advance my slide. We have provided help, and this is my moment of shameless commerce, in the form of this translation that I've done with Jaap Jacobs, sorry, my wonderful colleague in Scotland, and our friends and colleagues at the Getty Research Institute. So, you know, you can dip in. And there's also a wonderful French translation for those of you who would prefer by Jan Blanc. Now, Van Hoogstraten's book was published nearly a decade after Rembrandt's death and just months before Van Hoogstraten himself died at the ripe old age of 51. He did a lot in a short life, I would say. His book serves as a coda to the extraordinary period of artistic production and innovation that we saw in the Netherlands during his lifetime. He participated in this artistic boom, which was in full swing when he became of age as a painter. He also witnessed its collapse over the course of his career. So by the time the book was published in 1678, the market for painting had contracted precipitously since the 1660s, and the prospect of forging a successful career as a painter was indeed an uphill battle. So appropriate that the artist is suited up in armor, right? And aided by the muses, not so much in fighting a battle on the battlefield, but in waging a competitive war, as it were, with his colleagues through the wielding of pen and brush and paint. Now, this book was an argument for many things, but one of them was for the dignity of the profession and the value of sustaining it in the face of many, many challenges. Hoogstraten faced these challenges with a combination of talent, ambition, opportunity, ingenuity, and an understanding of the monetary and the honor economies in which, or on which, I would say, the value of art depends. So in my remarks today, I'd like to consider briefly a few of the lessons that van Hoogstraten drew from his formative experience with Rembrandt, and how he used them to advantage in forging his own successful career. So I'll touch on some pedagogical methods, on Hoogstraten's practice-based theory of painting, and on his career and business strategies. So at first glance, looking at these two works, you might think, oh, these are by different artists, but in fact, they are both by Samuel van Hoogstraten. And they suggest something of the range of his pictorial production, which included paintings, prints, drawings in every genre, from biblical and mythological narratives to portraits, landscapes, perspectives, perspective boxes, and trompe-l'oeil pieces. Now, van Hoogstraten's own student, Arnold Houbraken, he was lucky, he had a student who wrote his biography shortly after he died, characterized his teacher in just these terms. He was driven, says Houbraken, by an exceptionally competitive spirit with respect to other artists, not as it often happens due to some welling up of ill will toward particular individuals and their shining successes, which is contemptible, but rather out of a kind of ambition, and because he could not endure anyone surpassing him in any part of art. Outpacing him in the contest for laurels. And if others seemed to want to surpass him in any part of the art, he would soon be following close on their heels. Buildings, restless seas, still waters, animals, flowers, fruits, still life, which he painted so naturally that many were deceived by them. Whatever it might be, he knew how to pursue it and make it his own. And it speaks to not only ambition, but the way in which Hoogstraten tried to do everything. And his way of understanding things was really to make them. And I'm going to be kind of coming back to this theme of the knowledge and value of making, the knowledge involved in and the value of this kind of making. Now, the adoration of the child that you see on the left is, in fact, a work in the exhibition, and it's a fine example of Hoogstraten's early narratives in the Rembrandt mode. You would, I think, recognize this as coming out of that circle, the palette, the setup, and everything about it says Rembrandt brand. But the other work, which is separated from it by, nearly a quarter century, is the work of a cosmopolitan, mature van Hoogstraten. It's a kind of demonstration piece, I believe done just after he had returned to the Netherlands from a stint in London. And I would add parenthetically here that Hoogstraten's career was spent half in the Netherlands and half elsewhere. After his time with Rembrandt, he went to Italy and worked in the Holy Roman Empire for a while, came back after 5 years, settled down, and then goes to England again for another 5 years. So this is somebody who sees Dutch art from within and from without, which is an interesting dual perspective. And this is a piece in which he pulls out all the stops to show the range of his expertise in many genres and modes. You sort of feel like, on the one hand, Serlio on the left has met Van Eyck on the right? There are lots of things going on here. And he sets a very popular genre subject, that of the woman reading a letter, into an original framework. This is one of his sort of trademark inventions, these threshold pictures that situate you opposite a multi-focal scene. Now, by the 1640s, Rembrandt's reputation had attracted a lively circle of ambitious and talented artists, along with well-heeled amateurs, all of whom paid handsomely for instruction with the master, to his studio. the studio was interesting because it was a kind of hybrid of teaching academy workshop in which the pupils aspiring to careers in painting contributed to the commercial output of the studio as part of their training. Van Hoogstraten drew important lessons from this. He set up his own studio when he left Rembrandt and was a teacher as well as a painter in Dordrecht, which is where his natal town. So let's look at what he was doing there with Rembrandt as a young man. Imagine him at age 15 going off after his father, who was also a painter and who gave him his basic training, had passed away. And Hoogstraten spent a couple of years being trained for other careers, probably in the Latin school, but ultimately persuaded his family that he wanted to continue with painting. So he went the ambitious route to Amsterdam. And there, as a young man, he is doing what many of the pupils did as part of their training and exercise, self-portraits, just as Rembrandt himself did. It's awkward and sort of exudes earnestness in its situation of the young artist drawing. And you can see how much attention he's paid to the framing of this to sort of give it a setting and a raison d'etre. And he also has kind of not got the posture right. So there are a couple of dark lines that I think you can see on his right arm, our left. And these are corrections by Rembrandt. And he's kind of shown him how to get that right. And you can see in the painting on the right, which comes several years later, that he's mastered that. He's set the artist in a posture that actually shows the attentiveness, the sustained attention, that the focus that's involved in making a picture. And this is a theme that he will deal with in his writing extensively. The coordination of hand, mind, and eye that painting and drawing involve is a special kind of knowledge, and Hoogstraten gives it great value and explains it by way of a contest at one point in the text, a contest among painters who coordinated hand, mind, and eye in a different, each in a different mode. And this is the famous story of three landscape painters, Vergoyen, Porcellus, and Knipbergen, who make a bet about who can make the best painting in the space of a day. And Hoogstraten explains there are different ways of privileging hand, mind, and eye, or in getting them into coordination. I'm not going to go into that here, but I just wanted to bring it up. So you can see that Rembrandt's model provided Hoogstraten with various templates for thinking about his own self-image. Now, I think the skill with which he has staged that act of drawing in a way that conveys the intensity of focus, attentive observation, one of the things that he stresses over and over again in his pedagogical program, you can see how that might argue very well for him being the author or maker of the painting now in Chicago, over which Jacquelyn now is the curatorial steward. That painting, which was thought to be by Rembrandt, is then subsequently attributed to the school, seems very likely to be in the ballpark of Hoogstraten's own expertise and approach to setting figures in poses and conveying something of their intellectual, mental, interior presence. Right? Now, when he took up the subject of the adoration, he was clearly looking at, as the pupils did, Rembrandt. So they're working together on similar subjects. And what he takes from this, what he's really interested in, is light and its different manifestations and the ways in which light and dark help to bind and orchestrate the pictorial unity of a picture, but also, as you see, the firelight, the light from the lantern on the very far left, and then the divine light emanating from the Christ child. They're all carefully differentiated and attended to in van Hoogstraten's picture. He did a number of drawings, and that was a hugely important part of the pedagogical agenda in Rembrandt's studio. They were assigned to invent and rehearse narratives, and that's a practice that Hoogstraten maintained after he left. And these are drawings that he did after his time with Rembrandt. And you see how marvelously attentive he is to light effects and how he uses chalks and washes to make, as it were, painted drawings, these kind of painterly drawings, some people call them. I think I called them painted drawings in my earlier work on Hoogstraten, but they kind of straddle the boundaries between those different media in order to exercise the artist's skill in staging narrative works. And there you can see even more clearly in the larger view. Now, I wanted to bring in just briefly a curious drawing, which seems to have disappeared from the internet somehow, but it is a picture that has been attributed to Hoogstraten and other Rembrandt pupils, but its interest is that on the backside, it has some comments. We don't know whose hand the initial comments are in. We imagine that this might be Rembrandt's reaction, that it would be a little better if the ass were seen from behind so that these heads don't, for more variety, and that you put more vegetation. And then there's a problem with Joseph and Mary. He's straining too much. Mary's not holding the child right. And then in Hoogstraten's hand, which is very easy to recognize, it says, yeah, Joseph's too short, too fat, head growing out of his chest, and the heads of both are way too large. So you get a sense of the kind of critical critiques that are happening in relation to these drawings. And he had his own students, according to Houbraken's report, do once a week, they had to be kind of vetted on their interpretation of a story. In the exhibition, there are also a pairing, there's an interesting pairing of Hoogstraten and Rembrandt doing the same subject, the baptism of the Ethiopian chamberlain. Interesting here is the fact that we're looking, if the dates are right here, and I'm not the final word on that, but we are looking at work done after Hoogstraten left. He was there in the studio from about 1643 to 48. And this is obviously a drawing that Rembrandt did after that, and one that Hoogstraten sort of adapted, interestingly showing the baptism as a baptism of immersion, the kind of baptism that he himself underwent. And it raises the question of how he had access to that drawing. Did he buy it? Was it one of those drawings that was sold off in 1656 when Rembrandt declared bankruptcy? Did somebody else that he knew have it? It's a question that I raised just because it hadn't occurred to me before seeing them in this show. Now, the other thing that that Hoogstraten is well noted for is his comments on Rembrandt's Night Watch. And there are only a couple of paintings that Hoogstraten talks about at any length. And I mean by length, a few sentences. The rest of his commentary is much more general, but Rembrandt's work that he knew from his time there comes up for discussion. And it's clear that when he went off on his own after leaving the studio, he goes to Italy and Vienna in 1651. And in 52, he's landed a commission for a full-length portrait, something he hasn't really done before. And what does he do? He looks back to and sort of emulates the example of Rembrandt. Is he a Rembrandt? No, I don't think so. And he doesn't think so quite either. And he doesn't compete with Rembrandt on Rembrandt's terms, but on his own. What he does do, though, is recognize the difference of Rembrandt's and the really extraordinarily innovative way in which Rembrandt approached his work. Of the Night Watch, he recognized that he had turned Rembrandt the picture into a narrative. Normally, these group portraits were kind of mugshots, glorified mugshots, lines of people, individual portraits, and Rembrandt makes a story out of it. And Stratton admires that, and he gives it as an example for how you organize a narrative painting. Interesting that a portrait serves as a model for narrative. And he says, even though people have criticized Rembrandt for putting too much other stuff in there, he thinks it's going to outlast everything else because it is so well put together. It's so powerful that everything else just looks like playing cards. He goes, but, and this is what, students do with teachers, you always have to be a little bit critical. He says, I wish he would have sparked a few more lights in it. And he also talks about Rembrandt in the context of mastering the effects of light, reflected light. So this is an area in which he thinks Rembrandt is really extraordinarily talented, and that's kind of why he goes there. But he says this was really his element. However, he made these prints, which are really extraordinary in their pressing the limits of the medium and making, the visibility of the image, throwing that into question through this constant reworking. And Stratton is a bit critical about that. He says he doesn't do the measure of light that you need to do if you're going to keep all of your lights calibrated so you don't make the picture disappear. I'm super paraphrasing here because I want to get you to this next point, which has to do with what he learned from Rembrandt about making a career as a painter. The first thing that he does is set up shop in Dordrecht on his own and starts teaching pupils. And then he takes off for 5 years and makes a reputation. The most important thing at his point in his career is to give his name wider recognition and value by having his work validated by important people. And he does that at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna. And he does it through the presentation of several pictures, one of which is a trompe-l'oeil. And the emperor is so enamored of it that he gives Stratton an honorarium, this gold medallion that you see among all these trophies of Stratton's achievements. He's written, by the time he makes this picture, he's written books and plays and poems. And he has also achieved a certain level of recognition outside of the Netherlands. He wants to be recognized in his portrait there, not so much in his likeness, but in his artistry, right? He wants the value of that, and he performs it for you in that trompe-l'oeil, which is the kind of painting for which he got the award itself. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about it, but I do want you to see that even though this looks very different from Rembrandt's work, this is an extraordinary trompe-l'oeil painting. It's very painterly. The paint is applied in ways that are, I think, unusual in the realm of trompe-l'oeil. So there are always these after bits of Rembrandt's teaching. When he competes, he does it in ways that are unique, I think, to him, but also informed by this need to show that he can do what everybody else is doing. In 1654, when the painter Gerard ter Borch created his own new brand with these marvelous satin skirts that I'm sure many of you recognize, Stratton does a kind of framing of ter Borch's art in an invention of his own. And interestingly, plays to his strengths. He knows how to do these marvelous perspectives, and he is able to frame a competitive dialogue between himself and ter Borch in a way stressing his own strengths and putting ter Borch in the background, so he doesn't have to do ter Borch skirts, right? You recognize that skirt right away. These are the things that he devises to create his own kind of product, right? On small scale, on large scale, and with great ingenuity. I want to conclude with the one time that Stratton puts words in the mouth of his teacher. He tells that when he pestered Rembrandt with too many questions about causes, Rembrandt said to him, look, be satisfied with putting into good practice what you already know. And then the mysteries that you're now inquiring into will be eventually revealed. And he talks repeatedly in the book about the need to have know-how, practical science that is expressed in being able to make things. There's an understanding that comes through that sets painters apart from others who might want to express their views on art. And I think he's consistent with Rembrandt in painting the expertise of those who don't know how to paint in a rather negative light. This is that satirical picture where the art critic is shown with ass's ears and the painter giving his judgment with a sign of what that opinion is worth. Stratton says it's laughable to hear the verdict of presumptuous art experts about paintings. They just don't only deceive ignorant art lovers, they deceive themselves. And he says, these asses, nonetheless, have so much credibility in many cities that their judgment is more esteemed than that of true art experts, whereas it is nonetheless certain and sure that no one can rightly judge the quality of painting other those who rightly and properly understand the fundamentals of the art in the way we treat them in this work. It's often noted that when students left Rembrandt, they created distinctive products, and that's certainly the case for van Hoogstraten. But he also keeps Rembrandt in his art in ways that sometimes you don't even anticipate or expect. This Cupid blowing a bubble is the model for a little genius that is a figure on the exterior of van Hoogstraten's well-known perspective cabinet in London, which has on its exterior a trio of incentives that drive people to make art. And these come from Seneca, the ancient philosopher: fame, gain, and the love of art itself. And fame here is figured as the genius crowns a painter with laurel and decorates him with an honorific golden chain, just like Hoogstraten got. And wealth as a youthful Plutus, a god of wealth, and a cornucopia of coins spills out in front of a painter painting a portrait. The love of art is shown as an artist painting nature personified. Years later, Hoogstraten would write that though Seneca had presented fame and fortune as fruits ideally derived from the love of art, in fact, any one of these motives was powerful enough to spur an alert mind to take up painting. By then, he understood that neither the love of art nor talent alone could guarantee reputation and recompense. Those benefits depended on an artist's sagacity in building name recognition, placing their work in circulation and in distinguished venues, and by bolstering the social and economic value of art by buying, collecting, and trading it. Stratton wrote with a nod to Cicero, works of art are worth the price that artists put on them among themselves. In Rembrandt, he had an eminently successful model in doing so. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Celeste, for that wonderful exploration of one of Rembrandt's most talented pupils and a master truly in his own right. And thank you especially for including some of the objects that people will have an opportunity to see in our exhibition, both in Ottawa and later on when it goes to the Stateholder Museum in Frankfurt. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Suzanne van de Meerendonk, who's recently joined Queen's University as Bader Curator at the Agnes Etherington Art Center. Susana received her master's degree from the University of Amsterdam and PhD from the University of California at Santa Barbara. Her research interests span different media and include the role of art and propaganda in state-making processes, the formation of cultural memory and identity, and the history of collecting and provenance. Her doctoral thesis examined ephemeral decoration programs for joyous entries into Amsterdam between 1580 and 1660, and her talk today centers on one such event that Rembrandt might have seen with his own eyes, the visit to Amsterdam in 1638 of the French Queen Mother, Marie de Medici. Susana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephanie, for your introduction, and of course the whole team at the gallery for inviting me. I cannot wait to see the exhibition, of course, and I'm honored to speak at this symposium about Amsterdam and Rembrandt, which is ironic in a way since my talk today will focus on an aspect of Amsterdam's cultural life in which Rembrandt is notably absent, which is that, of course, of the city's tradition of joyous entry festivities, as you mentioned. So what are joyous entries? This term was used to refer to the ritual entry of rulers into a city, accompanied by elaborate decoration schemes and pageantry. This traditionally culminated in an oath ceremony where the ruler promised to uphold the city's rights and privileges, and representatives of the city swore allegiance and obedience to the ruler. This formed a long-standing custom throughout medieval and early modern Europe, in which the relationship between ruler and city was negotiated, reconfirmed, or contested. But following the Dutch revolts in a new republican context, this essentially monarchical tradition took on a different character. In the early years of the revolt, receptions were held for the emerging state's new leadership, such as the Stateholders and the Governor Generals. And later on, receptions were more often organized for foreign royalty. And so that's what we'll talk about today. Arguably the most spectacular of these were commissioned by the city of Amsterdam. While usually ephemeral in nature, the decoration programs designed for royal entries provided important opportunities for artists to showcase their talents for spectacular design. In many cities, the most renowned painters were enlisted to help create such displays. For instance, the spectacular reception of Archduke Ferdinand in Antwerp in 1635. This featured dozens of large-scale paintings installed on temporarily erected triumphal arches, which were designed by Peter Paul Rubens and executed by a team of artists working under his direction. When 3 years later, in 1638, Amsterdam organized a public reception for the French Queen Mother, Marie de Medici, perhaps one could have envisioned a similar role for Rembrandt. He was, after all, one of the most esteemed artists in the city by then. This, however, was not the case. In fact, none of Amsterdam's prominent painters seem to have been involved in the design or execution of decorations that day. Triumphal arches were a feature of joyous entries in Amsterdam too, but were generally animated by tableaux vivants, or theatrical scenes performed by still figures. Two of such arches decorated Marie's processional entry into the city, where she was escorted by civic militia companies, both mounted and on foot. A floating theater erected in the Rokin waters staged additional tableaux vivants on the third day of her visit. And she was also treated to an elaborate banquet as well as tours of the city. Rather than painters, the city's leading poets and intellectuals were enlisted to devise the festival program, including Pieter Cornelis van Hooft and Caspar Barleyus. The latter was also responsible for authoring a lushly illustrated festival book describing the events that was published afterwards. And we've already seen a few examples of that on my previous slides. And so the Latin edition entitled Medici Hospice appeared in 1638 alongside a French edition and a Dutch translation the following year. There are several reasons for the absence of painted decorations. The first one perhaps is of a pragmatic nature. In dynastic monarchies, the visit of a new ruler was typically announced well in advance. Amsterdam, along with other cities in the Republic, learned of Marie de Medici's arrival a mere 2 weeks beforehand. And so you see here this resolution by the city's burgomasters about receiving her, agreeing to do this, dates to August 18, and concrete information of her arrival was first discussed in the States of Holland only a day prior. So this does not leave a lot of time to prepare elaborate painted decorations before September 1st, which is when she arrived. Also, rather than a royal figure with sovereign rule over the city, by the time of her visit, Marie de Medici had spent 7 years in exile as the result of a dispute with her son, the French King Louis XIII, and was traveling through Europe to seek support for her cause. So the political gravity of her visit should thus be understood on rather different terms. A final reason, and I would argue an important one, can be connected to Amsterdam's desire to use this occasion to increase the visibility of its political status and economic power. More than any painted decoration scheme could, the event formed an ideal opportunity to showcase the city as a spectacle in and of itself. Despite her controversial status, Marie de Medici was the first royal figure to personally visit and thereby explicitly acknowledge the Dutch Republic as a sovereign state. And so for those of you who don't know, this was not at all accepted until the Peace of Munster in 1648. For Amsterdam, this meant the event provided an opportunity to display and by way of publication also legitimize the forms of power emerging through its trade-based empire. In this role, the event served not only to broadcast the Republic's relative status among Europe's rulers, but also to affirm Amsterdam's political and economic supremacy, both at home and abroad. While lamenting the limited time for preparations, Hooft wrote to Barleyus on August 22nd, so that's 4 days after that resolution we saw, that the city's harbor would provide Marie, quote, with a spectacle her eyes have not and will never have experienced anywhere else, unquote. That this was of great concern to the city can be learned from its efforts to stage the Queen's arrival, albeit unsuccessfully, exactly via this route. City pensionary Willem Boreel traveled to Haarlem 1 day before the entry to inquire whether Marie wished to arrive in the city via land or by sea. Though Boreel emphasized the beautiful sights that the city's harbor would provide, Marie decided to travel by land. So the trip to Amsterdam, therefore, followed the towpath along the newly dug barge canal called Nieuwe Vaart. So that's the that's the straight red line that you see on the map there. And of course, this would be a very comfortable journey, and it's very, that's not surprising. She chose that option. And then at the midpoint between Haarlem and Amsterdam, which is indicated here by the blue star at halfweg, Marie was met by a multitude of yachts, including a large West India Company ship, which had been arranged to transport the Queen if she had opted to travel by water. And of course, she again declined. Lushly decorated and under full sail, the ships provided a precursory introduction to this city of merchants. Per existing custom, the entry was then announced with the firing of heavy artillery and the sounding of bells throughout the city. And you see on the map here, her entry took place at the Haarlemmer Gate, and then you see the processional route indicated here Along the route, there were two triumphal arches, as I mentioned, which are indicated by the blue stars. And then it ended at her place of lodging, which is indicated by the yellow star. And if she had arrived by water, she would have seen additional spectacles there in the Damrak waters, which is indicated here by the green star. But those were not performed because she chose to take a different route. So on the second day of Marie's visit, oh, sorry, I forgot to say one other thing, which is that in the interest of time, I cannot describe the full program of tableaux vivants that Marie witnessed, both during her entry and on subsequent days. But it is important to note that spectacular views and ephemeral decorations aside, the city was also home to impressive reception rooms that could be quickly converted for diplomatic purposes and that carried the same message regarding Amsterdam's economic superiority. So on the second day of Marie's visit, a festive banquet took place at the headquarters of the East India Company, which is called the East India House. The original building, erected in 1606, was renovated and enlarged just a few years earlier. Barleyus, in his account of the visit, describes the building as dense with exoticizing ornaments in the form of paintings from China and Japan, foreign weapons and turtle shells, as well as colonial markers such as maps and images of Dutch possessions. One of the works that Mary de' Medici will have seen in the Great Hall was the painting View of Ambon, which visualized the company's history of conquest and possession in the East Indies. From the building's decorations, Barleyus makes an uninterrupted transition to a description of the spectacle provided by the spices, fabrics, porcelain, and other goods stored within the building. He emphasizes that the riches that these goods have brought the city he emphasizes the riches that these goods have brought the city and significantly stressed the ability of the trading companies to raise armies and to, quote, do and cause things which do not differ much from the power of the greatest monarchs and kings, unquote. According to Barleyus, the banquet was a feast of the senses through which the city was able to treat the queen just as well as any king or prince. In addition to more traditional fare, it displayed a broad selection of spices and other products, including mace and nutmeg, which we should note was produced by enslaved labor on the Banda Islands at this time, pepper, cinnamon, but also non-edible items such as Direx's incense, silk, and indigo. All these items were presented in large porcelain serving dishes to entertain and entice the royal guest. Barleyus emphasized the ease with which the city was able to do so by remarking that none of the goods displayed were especially created or obtained for the occasion, but rather formed part of the supplies that were available in the company's warehouses on a permanent basis. The capacity of such goods to represent the far-reaching power of those able to get their hands on them was employed again and again to demonstrate the city's magnificence relative to other global powers. So did the city as spectacle strategy leave no room at all for Rembrandt and his colleagues? Perhaps there were indeed not many opportunities for them on the day of the event itself, but its commemoration, however, required a variety of artistic translations. First and foremost, this was true for Barleyus's festival account, which included prints by specialist artists, some of which, of course, we have already seen. And here are two examples, for instance, of scenes by where the designs were produced on the left by Jan Martin de Jonge, who was a specialist in cavalry and battle scenes. And so he was responsible for all the scenes that depicted the procession. And on the right, you see a design or print based on a design by Simon de Vlieger, who was a maritime painter, and he was responsible for all the waterborne scenes. And so the event seemingly held particular relevance for its so-called home audience, and this is underscored by customized copies of the festival book's Dutch edition, which include carefully hand-colored prints, such as these examples from the Getty Research Institute, as well as presentation copies with additionally inserted prints, such as this example of a large format presentation copy, which is now held in the New York Public Library, and it has these large fold-out prints additionally inserted and was presented by the burgomasters to one of the aldermen after the event. The visit furthermore resulted in a few portraits, including one of Mary de Medici herself by Gerrit Fonthorst, as well as a group portrait of the Amsterdam burgomasters by Thomas de Keyser, while they're awaiting news of the arrival of the Queen Mother into the city. And both of these were also translated into print, and those prints you can also often find in copies of Barlaeus' festival book. Some scholars have also connected the 1638 entry to the decoration program designed for the renovated Great Hall of the city's arquebusiers militia building, or the Kloveniersdoelen, primarily due to the civic militia portrait of the company of Captain Cornelis Bicker, which was done by Joachim Sandraert. Bicker, as the colonel, had met the French Queen Mother at the Haarlemmer Gate, so where she entered the city, on the day of her arrival, and played as such a significant role in the festivities. And so it's no surprise that they would like to have that moment commemorated. So this painting, along with a series of other newly commissioned works for the same room, including Rembrandt's famed Night Watch of 1642, has raised the question if the entire painting ensemble for this room served to commemorate the 1638 entry. While this may be debated, and in fact, research has shown that this was likely not the case, I do believe strongly that the room's decoration scheme, which has the effect of showing militiamen lined up as they would have lined the streets during a procession, served to recall the pride that was associated with the civics militia, very prominent role during such moments. And the entry of Mary de Medici could very well have given impetus to a renewed consideration of that role in the context of Amsterdam's increased significance and visibility in international diplomacy. It is important to note that, like the East India House, this Great Hall of the Kloveniersdoelen would in fact play an important role as a reception room during later entries. To conclude, the example of the 1638 Medici entry shows that such occasions manifested in a transnational language of royal courtly custom, while internationally recognized conventions were also adapted and transformed to serve new interests. And the precise relation between ephemeral ceremonies and the permanent artworks and decorations commissioned for Amsterdam's monumental new buildings, as also Jacquelyn, of course, in her talk talked about, provides a particularly compelling avenue for further research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susana. It's fascinating to think about the pageantry of life in a city like Amsterdam, and so much of what happened is lost to us because there's no material record of it. So thank you very much for bringing that event to life for us. Now, before I invite everyone back for questions and conversation, I'm very pleased to introduce our fourth and final speaker, Weixuan Li, currently a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam. Weixuan earned a master's degree at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and her research brings together a unique combination of digital and art historical methods to shed light on artists' lives and market trends in 17th century Amsterdam. Her PhD project, Virtual Interiors as Interfaces for Big Historical Data, is funded by the Dutch Research Council, NVO. And today she's going to offer us a peek behind closed doors into the homes and workshops of Rembrandt and several artists in his creative network in Amsterdam. Weixuan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction, and congratulations again on putting together such a great exhibition. I'm only looking forward to see it when they travel to Europe, and we bet we can travel by then. And as the last presenter in this panel, I would like to bring the attention briefly back to Rembrandt and his life, and I will add a little bit digital flavor to the research around this grandmaster, as well as the painters and art dealers around him in Amsterdam. So in 1639, Rembrandt moved into a new house. By then, he had been living in Amsterdam for several years and had moved a few times within the city. But this time was different. He became a proud owner of a grand house right next to the house of his former dealer Hendrik Ellenberg, and where he worked as a chief painter for a few years. Rembrandt spent almost 2 decades in this particular house until his financial predicament ended up in a bitter bankruptcy in 1656, which forced him to auction off his house 2 years later. The timing of Rembrandt's moving in and out of his grand house deserves further attention because they correlated with some major shifts in the art market. And these shifts, as Eric Jan Slaughter recently argued, coincided with the plague outbreaks in Amsterdam. The waves of epidemics in 1635, 1655, and 63, Slaughter argued, not only had claimed the tens of thousands lives, but also had a decisive impact on the art market. And the market condition and the plague could also cast new light on Rembrandt's life events. The master brought his house when the art market expansion came to a standstill shortly after the 1635 plague. Rembrandt was certainly feeling the market pressure around 1639. As our host today, Stephanie Dickey, argued, Rembrandt tried to compete with both the old masters as well as his Stateholder, Johann van Sandrat. And moving into this grand house could have been Rembrandt's response to the competitive pressure and the stagnating market in order to gain some leverage by staging himself in an impressive setting. A year later, after 1640, the art market broke through from the stalemate by adopting new strategies and new styles to which Rembrandt did not comply. Rembrandt did witness from this house another episode of market expansion, but without enjoying much of its benefits, because by then he was increasingly working in the style that was falling out of fashion. When Rembrandt was deep in debt in the early 1650s, the art market began to show the instability and the first sign of decline. The precarious market condition was exacerbated by the First Anglo-Dutch War, as well as the plague of 1655. And in the following year, in 1656, Rembrandt declared bankruptcy. The Rembrandt strategy showed us how vulnerable the Dutch art market was to internal and external shocks. It also bestowed upon us a 20-page inventory of the Rembrandt's possessions by room. This inventory allows us to peek into the house, Rembrandt's house, behind the scanty visual evidence and provide some senses of how space was arranged and used by the artist and his family. Although historians have yet to reach a consensus about the exact layout on each floor, they mostly agree on the locations and functions of the major spaces. For instance, the 2 street-facing houses were used as reception spaces, and the workshop as well as the art room were located upstairs. The artist was clearly working from home. Rembrandt certainly lived in a grand style. As Perry Chapman argued that the artist turned his house into a deliberately crafted stage, a site of personal display. But was this unique to Rembrandt? And did Rembrandt conform to the norm of interior decoration, or did he deviate from it? How did other painters and art dealers in Amsterdam arrange their homes? To answer these questions, our project resembled and transcribed about 50 inventories of painters and art dealers in the 17th century Amsterdam that assigned objects to rooms. Following the sequence of rooms registered in the inventories, I reconstructed the house structures in the same way that Rembrandt scholar did to Rembrandt's house. And these inventories review 3 main types of houses varying in size. These house typologies outline the vastly different conditions in which painters operated their painting business in Amsterdam. Some lived and worked in the rented room with only a handful of belongings. Some lived in the single floor house and squeezed their art supplies in all possible spaces in order to continue their work. An overwhelming majority of painters, however, lived in the typical double-story deep house, the Type 2 house, and invariably turned their upstairs rooms into workshops. Only a few could afford a large house and furnish it with costly collections that we encountered in Rembrandt's house. Apparently, Rembrandt's house exceeded most painters' homes, both in size and in extravagance, by a long shot. But the location of Rembrandt's studio and art rooms upstairs did comply with traditions. These arrangements perhaps served more to the functional need of light than advancing the mystics of a great artist. As we know from visual and written sources, our lovers and clients would climb the stairs in order to visit artists in their studio. But Rembrandt's readiness to show visitors his curiosity and erudition with his well-staged home and studio setting was perhaps new to his generation. The studio of Rembrandt's master, Peter Lossmann, whose house was just around the block, was a lot messier and more chaotic. The inventory listed paintings by Lossmann interspersed with copies suggested that this renowned painter had shared the same studio with his pupils, probably in the same way that Hornemans depicted in the painting decades later. And the other side of the studio was even worse. It was cluttered with a bed and many other household goods, and nothing picturesque or painterly cluttered as we see in Rembrandt's studio. It seems that Lossmann did not expect any visitors to his studio, and the guests were most likely received only in the forehouse, which was in turn packed with expensive furniture. And unlike Rembrandt, Lossmann was not under much market and competitive pressure because his career overlapped entirely with the rapid market expansion. He died before the market reached the first plateau after 1635. Contrary to Lossmann's good fortune was the artist who faced a declining market after the plague of 1663. The self-fashioning strategy that Rembrandt applied to his house was repeatedly seen in the inventories of high-end painters in the last decades of the century. The house of Michiel van Musser, the most popular and important portraitist in Amsterdam after 1670s. His impressive studio was a combination of a Kunstkammer and a workshop where many pricey items that he depicted in his paintings were displayed. And the furnishing of Van Musser's studio was the best of his house, even outshone that of the main reception space. An impressive studio and house may have become a standard for the top-notch artists in the later decades that was suitable for the new market condition. And this careful cultivation of interior space was not restricted to artists' homes, but was also found in those of the high-end art dealers. When Rembrandt's dealer Johannes de Regname died in 1657, he left a legacy of over 40,000 guilders and a stock of around 600 art pieces, including 13 paintings by Rembrandt. De Regname's house, where he operated his art dealership, certainly matched the scale and grandeur of his business. There were still some uncertainties around the exact location of this art dealer's house, but the rooms registered in the inventory can be roughly translated into the schematic drawings, as I show here. Although it is commonly believed that art dealing business was mostly operated from the most accessible street-facing ground floor spaces, the Reunion is the most lavish and perhaps the most important exhibition space in the Reuni's business practice was in the four-cammer, the front room upstairs. This room contained 90 paintings, most by the best old masters and the contemporary painters all over Europe, together with hundreds of carvings and other works of art. The value of this movable object in this room amounted to an astonishing 15,000 guilders, surpassing what Rembrandt had paid for his house. This room was likely filled to the brim, like the painting shop on the left. Another important space was the Hofsaal, the large hall, to the rear of the house. This room contained another 92 paintings and is likely a complementary exhibition space to the four-cammer, because there were only a small overlap in the artists featured in both rooms. The four-cammer covered mostly more old masters and semi-precious stones, while the Hofsaal presented more works by popular contemporary masters like Meerendonk. Although this room still features Rembrandt, it cannot be compared to the upstairs room, both by value and by number. In addition to these two spaces, another 300 comparably cheap pictures populated the remaining spaces in the upper floor. Remarkably, and despite the huge painting stock, relatively few paintings were found in the ground floor rooms. And these rooms, which were likely meant for public use, followed more of the traditional decoration decorum within the elite circle, rather than being used as a painting shop. In particular, the salon was lavishly furnished and adorned with gilt leather. The paintings mounted in this salon were mostly landscapes and pastoral scenes, perhaps to match the decoration style, which is very different from the two main exhibition spaces, which populated with history paintings and portraiture. The only sign on the ground floor, perhaps that gives away to the profession of the residents of this house, was the Hofportal, that perhaps leading to the Hofsaal where a Rembrandt was hung. The spatial arrangement and decoration of his house certainly attest to the Reuni's business acumen as a so-called gentleman leader. He was able to blend his art dealership into the social decorum of his targeted client circle. And the Reuni's house at the first glance just looked like a gentleman's house before the art dealing business started to seep in at the back of his house and upstairs. And to conclude, in Rembrandt's Amsterdam, displaying and dealing art took place in artists' and art dealers' homes, which vary greatly in size and extravagance. And the use of interior space, which may seem a private matter, was tied directly to the market conditions and indirectly to the historical events like the plague. Home was perhaps the absolute center of both personal and professional lives. And the working from home, the new reality that we all have been through for the past year, was the day-to-day life for artists and art dealers in Rembrandt's Amsterdam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Weixuan. It's fascinating to think about the experience of visiting an art dealer or artist's workshop in Rembrandt's Amsterdam, walking in there and choosing something on the walls, being an art consumer and art lover in that very rich and dynamic art market in which those artists were operating. And your research really brings that to life for us. I'm going to ask all of our speakers now to turn on their cameras and return to the conversation. And we will have a few minutes for questions. We've had some questions posed in the Q&A, mostly to individual speakers who have succeeded in engaging in some dialogue back and forth already with those questioners. So I think it might be a good idea in this part of the conversation for us to think about some perhaps broader issues that have been raised by all of these papers. I'm particularly interested in Amsterdam as a laboratory for creativity and competition, as a unique environment in which all of these artists were operating, as a unique opportunity for Rembrandt. I think the thesis of our exhibition was kind of that if he had just rested on his laurels and stayed in Leiden, making art out of his parents' basement, he probably still would have been a good artist, but he would never have achieved what he did. He would never have had the opportunities that he had by boldly choosing to move to the larger city of Amsterdam, where he could operate as one of the largest, and as Weixuan has shown us, most palatial workshops in the city, where dozens of artists like Stratton came to study with him, where he got to hobnob with major patrons like the ones who hosted Marie de Medici, and where he came back into contact with his old friend and rival Jan Levens, who eventually, after traveling to Antwerp and London, decided too that this was the place that you went to make your fortune. So many artists were arriving in Amsterdam, choosing to go there from other places. Rembrandt was just one of many who saw this as a mecca for creativity and competition. So maybe I will kind of go around to each of you, perhaps in the order in which we presented, and ask you if there's some aspect of Amsterdam as an environment that you think was particularly meaningful or unique for the topic that you've explored today. There's something about the fact that this happened in Amsterdam that perhaps wouldn't have happened anywhere else. So I will start with you, Jacquelyn.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think you described it beautifully, that Amsterdam was a laboratory. It had a range of artists, but also a range of patrons. And I think focusing on the ideas that I proposed today, part of the reason why Rembrandt was so out of step in terms of creating a composition that would harmonize with the rest of the Batavian series is that during this time in his career, he is in fact patronized, as you have written and others, by more collectors, poets, cultural figures in the city. And it is really Levens who spends more time networking and even socializing with the great political figures, those with great political might in the city. So I think that Amsterdam offered a significant spectrum that allowed all of these artists to thrive, and Rembrandt to find his own very specific niche in it.
Thank you. Celeste.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think one of the things that is so striking about Amsterdam is the possibility of seeing a great deal of art. I mean, I think for somebody like Hoogstraten, I'm going to take your question from the Hoogstraten angle. Here's somebody who's coming from Dordrecht, like a number of pupils who worked with Rembrandt. So there's some kind of a network. But Dordrecht, had seen its heyday as the trading entrepot of Holland in the Middle Ages. It's a conservative, small, they were kind of leveled off at around 20,000 people in Dordrecht. And here comes a 15-year-old from this town with all these distinguished histories that he's also a part of. That's another thing. And he comes to Amsterdam where, we're looking at a growing population coming up on 175,000 by then. It's gone to the big city. There's everything going on. So I'm thinking about the kind of iconosphere, the visual stimuli alone. And let's not even talk about the whole question of how ambitious students are going to push each other to, do better. That's part of Hoogstraten's thinking. You improve your game by working with people who are better than you or trying to do what they do as well, et cetera. These are kind of commonplace ideas, but in that context where You have not just patrons, but also collections of which, and auctions, where you had the possibility of seeing a great deal of stuff without leaving Holland. And, you know, that's kind of an interesting prospect. Also, I would add that Stratton gets out of town. I mean, as soon as he's trained, he doesn't try to make it in Amsterdam. He tries to make it in Dordrecht, and, you know, gets antsy to see the world and do stuff. And he can do that because he's got the resources to travel. Not every artist did. And so that moving out, I think, is also a competitive move. You have to figure where you've got a chance and how you've got a chance to compete. At that moment, it's, you know, it's there's a glut of people and art around. So I think it's interesting that he doesn't stay there, that he moves on.
One of the things that you made clear is how extraordinarily ambitious he was. Mm-hmm. And I think this was one of the key things that I took away from our research on the exhibition that makes Rembrandt stand out, that he was, as Boude van Bakker and others have argued, really he aspired to the ideal of the universal artist, not just someone filling a niche as a landscape painter or a portraitist, but trying to do it all. And Stratton clearly did the same. And maybe there isn't room in one city for a whole lot of people who have ambitions that grand. So, and also the lure of becoming a court painter seems to have appealed to him. Well, something Rembrandt was never very good at.
No, but you know, the interesting thing there too, I would just say, I think Rembrandt was extremely a powerful force in the lives of young people like a Stratton, who's lost a father. He's got a mentor in Rembrandt. He's looking at how he operates. And Stratton does not become a courtier or a court painter. He becomes a purveyor. He has court clientage, but he doesn't do that life. He gets the approval and the recognition and the status, but he's not busy, you know, cranking out royal portraits somewhere or leading a courtier's life. He's an entrepreneur, and that he's done and claims to do by his own merits. And so there's a little bit of overlap between Stratton and Rembrandt in that sense that it's the artist who should, in their ideal order of things, hold the cards as far as determining the value and importance of work, right? So they're really using, but also bucking the old-fashioned patronage system. So Stratton's interesting that way. So I'm glad you brought up the courtier business, because he's not a courtier.
Our focus on Rembrandt as a participant in a very active art market, it does cast the artist as entrepreneur, and I think that's another thing that's very true of Rembrandt, also of Lievens. When he came back, he worked for a number of different patrons, many other artists who are taking advantage of this extraordinary market. We have a couple of questions along those lines to get to in a minute, but I want to give Susana and Weixuan a chance to talk a little bit about Amsterdam. So Susana.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great question. And I do think that Amsterdam must have been a pretty extraordinary place to be as an artist or otherwise. And in regards to the traditions that I've looked at, I think in a way also you can return to the topic of the laboratory, but it's in a slightly different way, which is that you have these, sometimes century-long traditions that have to be reinterpreted and adapted to new contexts, which I think is quite fascinating. And it serves to underpin also new types, new forms of power that are emerging that are not based in what is considered kind of the traditional forms of power of monarchy that are known in Europe until that point. So you have a political environment where really new forms of power are seeking to express themselves. And of course, artists play a role in this as well. And you see that in both, these ephemeral decoration programs through performance of the theater, and also in the decorations of these monumental buildings, which of course in the talks we've come across the town hall and the Klovenierstoelen, and thinking about Amsterdam also as a place that during Rembrandt's lifetime, probably tripled in size. So it's really a city that's extremely dynamic, that's really exploding, in terms of space, in terms of new monumental structures and urban fabrics that needs decorations that also, address these radically changing conceptions of what it means to be powerful in the world at that time. And so for artists, I think that was a very probably exciting and really pretty radical, commission to sort of think through how to communicate that. And I think that also came through in some of our talks. That's really interesting.
Power is such a fundamental force in culture and one we reckon with in many ways. And that segues actually into a question that's been posed in the chat. And I'm going to ask you, Weixuan, to answer my question and kind of use it to bridge into this. Questioner has posed the question, can we characterize the mercantile environment of Amsterdam in the 17th century as capitalism? And is that why the art market was flourishing so much there? And I think when Susana talks about the shift in the power balance, it is certainly true that hereditary nobility are not calling the shots anymore the way they do in most of Europe at that time. So since you are our expert on the art market on this panel, perhaps you could say a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I think the increasing wealth certainly increased Amsterdam's attractiveness as a center for artist creation. As Amanda said, art is happy when the wealth reigns. So in that sense, the ability to purchase art and the avid enthusiasm to collect art and then show them in their own house certainly nourish this art market and actually push it forward with the significant demand that calls for a lot of production from the artist side in order to contribute and fill the gap in the demand. So in that sense, the increase in wealth and the purchase power certainly contribute to the flourishing of the Amsterdam as a creative artistic city. So I think this case, if we expand our scope and time to this global artistic center, I think we see in 15th century Florence and the 16th century Antwerp, 17th century Amsterdam, then this 18th century London and the 19th century Paris. That's all coincided with the increase in wealth and in a sense, industrialization for London and Paris. So I wouldn't say this with capitalism, but it's definitely correlated with the increase in wealth. And that's this attractiveness of the city as an artistic center was able to assemble a large crowd of artists. Because and then this generate a lot of creativity and innovations, because innovation doesn't happen radically. It happens incrementally. And then as Stephanie said, it's experimental, it's a lab. They need a group of people who really push the envelope on different directions. And then with the result that it looks radical from the results, but they actually have a lot of experiments and incremental change in between. So in that sense, Amsterdam is certainly the biggest center for not only the Dutch painters, and also for the internationals like Johan van Sandraat, a cosmopolitan artist that moved to Amsterdam to pursue his career. That's also make Amsterdam even more attractive for the other artists, because it's a place that the dreams to become someone, a superstar, will come true.
Very interesting. And I think one of the aspects of the Amsterdam art market that we've tried to show with our exhibition is the variety and diversity of products that were available through artists. And we don't show, because it's an exhibition of the very best objects that we could select, we don't show what one recent writer, Angela Jager, called the paintings that are available for a dime a dozen. And not only was the market broad, it was also very deep, right? And everybody was collecting art. It's really a remarkable thing that even shopkeepers and butchers and bakers have paintings on their walls, as one foreign visitor pointed out. So it is a thriving market at many, what we might call price points if you want to think about it in capitalist terms today. And that variety leads to another question that has come up in the chat, and that is, we mentioned the fact that Rembrandt, or Weixuan, I think it was you who mentioned the fact that Rembrandt at a certain point goes out of style, or his work is no longer the height of fashion. And the questioner wants to know what was in fashion when he was falling out of fashion. And the short answer, of course, is what is sometimes referred to as the clear style or the bright style, something a little more appealing to someone who's a little tired of all that remarkable glimmering candlelight that Stratton loved so much. But I wonder if anyone else has something further to say about that, about what kinds of things were available in Amsterdam, or what it was that led Rembrandt to fall out of fashion. Any thoughts about that? Maybe Jacquelyn, you know, it might be interesting to ask you to speak about this, because Lievens, although today he's not the household name that Rembrandt is, for a certain period there, when he got back to Amsterdam, he was doing better than Rembrandt was in terms of the commissions he was getting. So, you know, what was it that made him so successful?
Thank you for highlighting that, Stephanie. I'm always delighted to celebrate Lievens and his accomplishments. I think that part of it was his networking ability, which Huygens even refers to back in 1629. He tells this great story that is familiar to many of us, that upon his first meeting with Lievens in Leiden, they discussed a portrait that Lievens would do of Huygens. And then just a few days later, the artist ends up on his doorstep in The Hague to start that portrait. And so I think there was a certain skill, a soft skill that Lievens had, this ability to connect, to follow up, broadly speaking, networking skills. That combined with the experience that he received in London and Antwerp to work on a larger scale. Most prominently, Lievens had great success in the Amsterdam Town Hall. His Grand Mars still hangs today in the government building, and that was known as the location of the States of Holland and West Friesland in the 17th century. I think his ability to work quickly and on a large scale helped with some of these more prominent commissions that he received. And that was certainly what was happening during this moment of crafting a local, specific to Amsterdam, but also a national identity for this new republic. And I think all of the speakers have touched upon that in really rich ways today.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's a really good to realize. And I kind of hope that when visitors come to our exhibition, they'll fall in love with some of these other artists. The wonderful Adoration of the Magi by Stratton is on view there. There's a fabulous portrait by Lievens. And we have an opportunity to introduce viewers who are not perhaps so familiar with some of these artists to Rembrandt's contemporaries, as well as Rembrandt himself. And in his own time, he was not the only game in town. He wasn't. And that was really that. And I think that richly competitive environment is kind of what pushed him to keep innovating and to keep adjusting. And eventually his style became admired primarily by a close-knit group of connoisseurs who still valued what he had to offer. But meanwhile, there were many people who chose other things, and we can introduce that topic and some of those other things to people, as well as the work of Rembrandt himself. So, and as some people know, our installation in Ottawa also brings in a number of works by contemporary Black and Indigenous artists to address some of the issues that were only briefly alluded here today, particularly by Susana, who mentioned the global range of products that were flowing into the markets of Amsterdam, and unfortunately, the use of enslaved labor to make some of that richness possible. Amsterdam wealth was derived in large part from colonial expansion, and it had consequences around the world. So thank you all so much. I think we've run to the end of our question period. And I'd like to let everyone know that as soon as we conclude, you have the opportunity to be the first to see the second part of our program today, which is a discussion following from the topic I mentioned just a minute ago with three speakers from Amsterdam: Carouan Fata Black from Leiden University, Asfa Beinar from Education Studio, and Falke Smulders from the Rijksmuseum, one of the curators of the current exhibition at the Rijksmuseum, which has to do with the legacy of slavery. And they will discuss the significance of enacting socially and culturally inclusive strategies in museums today to deal with this very pressing and timely issue. This program with these three speakers was in fact recorded. So you can listen to it now, or you can listen to it later on the National Gallery's website. As we close today's event, I would like to acknowledge the generosity of Bader Philanthropies, who provided a grant in support of this symposium and other educational programming related to the exhibition Rembrandt in Amsterdam. This symposium is the last live event planned for this exhibition, but this event and others will be available in recorded form on the gallery website in the coming weeks. I'd also direct your attention to some of the other educational materials that are there, especially a remarkable educational video called a Digitorial, which takes you through Rembrandt's Amsterdam, produced together with the Stateholder Museum in Frankfurt, Germany, where this exhibition will travel in October. I hope many of the people listening today will be able to visit our exhibition in Ottawa or in Frankfurt if you're tuning in from Europe. And again, a warm, warm thanks to all of our speakers for fascinating presentations today, and to all the people, Andrea Gumpert, and all the people behind the scenes at the National Gallery who made this event possible. So signing off from Ottawa this afternoon, thank you all and stay safe. Au revoir.